In Las Vegas, the worst hand you can be dealt isn't a bad run at the tables. It's a 30-day eviction notice for a home you thought you could afford. You know, there's a story I can't get out of my head. It was told to me by a woman who'd spent 35 years of her life walking the floor of the Stardust and then the MGM Grand in 3-inch heels. She was a cocktail waitress, one of the originals, the kind who knew your drink before you did and could carry 8 of them on a tray through a sea of roaring gamblers without spilling a drop. She told me about the deal. Not a written contract, you understand. Nothing you could sign. It was more like an unspoken pact between the city and its people. The city said, you give us your nights, your weekends, your holidays. You pour the drinks, you deal the cards, you clean the rooms, you power this great glittering machine in the middle of the desert, and in return, we'll give you a life. A real, honest-to-God life. Not the fantasy we sell to the tourists, but something solid, something you can build a family on. For her, that promise took the shape of a 3-bedroom ranch house in a quiet subdivision off Tropicana Avenue, a place so far from the strip you could actually see the stars at night. She bought it in 1994, and the down payment? She saved it in old chip trays she'd sweet-talked a pit boss into giving her. Every night she'd come home, kick off her heels, and stack the cash. 5s, 10s, the occasional lucky $100 bill from a high roller. She said the bank teller didn't even blink when she brought it all in, sorted and wrapped in rubber bands. That was Vegas then. The whole economy ran on cash and a handshake. The loan officer looked at her pay stub, saw the casino's name, and just nodded. He didn't need a fancy algorithm to understand her hustle. He knew it because his wife was a keno runner at the Sands. Her brother was a valet at Caesars. They were all in the same boat. They all understood the deal. Getting the keys to that house, she told me it was the first time she felt like she'd truly won something in this town. It wasn't a jackpot. It was better. It was real. It was a stucco box with a gravel yard, but it was hers. A piece of the American dream, bought and paid for with sore feet and a killer smile. That was the Las Vegas that existed just beneath the surface of the neon. It was a blue-collar town in a tuxedo, a place where a single mom serving screwdrivers could own a piece of the rock. Her neighbors were stagehands, blackjack dealers, chefs from the casino buffets. They'd have barbecues in their backyards, the smoke mixing with the smell of chlorine from the above-ground pools. Their kids played street hockey until the streetlights came on. They had a stake in the game. Real skin in the game. It was a community built on a shared secret that the greatest prize in Vegas wasn't on the casino floor. It was in these quiet neighborhoods the tourists never saw. The change, when it came, wasn't a thunderclap. It was a whisper. It started around the early 2000s. One of her neighbors, a guy who'd been dealing craps at the Flamingo for 20 years, put his house up for sale. He was retiring, moving to Florida. Standard stuff. But the way it sold wasn't standard. It didn't sit on the market for months. There was no haggling. A realtor just showed up one day with a couple from Newport Beach, California. They walked through the house once and made an offer right there on the spot, all cash, for 20% over asking price. The dealer couldn't sign the papers fast enough. Who could blame him? It was like hitting a slot machine for $100,000. At the barbecue that weekend, it was all anyone could talk about, an all-cash offer. It sounded like something from a movie, but then it happened again. A few houses down, a maid from the Bellagio sold her place to a software engineer from San Jose who wanted a vacation property. All cash. Then the house across the street, owned by a retired union electrician, went to an investment group out of Los Angeles. All cash. Each sale was like a small tremor, a little jolt that nobody quite understood. The money was different. It wasn't casino money. It wasn't earned in the trenches of the service industry. It felt abstract, weightless. You see, the old math of Vegas was simple. Your mortgage was a number you could understand. You could break it down into how many shifts you had to work, how many drinks you had to sell. You could feel it in your bones. This new math, it was incomprehensible. Suddenly, the value of her own small stucco house, her piece of the rock, wasn't tied to her labor anymore. It was tied to the whims of a stock market she didn't follow and a California real estate bubble that had decided to spill over the mountains. The newcomers were different too. They were perfectly nice, but they didn't get the rhythm of the city. They complained about the neighbor's barking dog or the fact that someone was mowing their lawn at 7 in the morning, not realizing that for half the block, 7 a.m. was their evening. They didn't understand the graveyard shift lifestyle. They weren't part of the ecosystem. They were just there. The sense of a shared struggle of being in it together began to fade. The neighborhood got quieter. The barbecues became less frequent. She told me about the day it really hit her. She was standing in her front yard, watering her rose bushes, and she looked up and down the street. The house on the left was a short-term rental now, a new group of tourists every weekend. The house on the right was empty, owned by some LLC with a P.O. box in Delaware. The house across the street, she didn't even know who lived there anymore. In the span of just a few years, her community had been replaced by a collection of assets. Her home had become a number on a spreadsheet, and she had this sinking feeling, a gambler's intuition, that the game had been changed. The rules had been rewritten while she wasn't looking. The old deal, the unspoken pact that had allowed her to build a life here, it was off the table, and she realized she was holding a losing hand in the only game that ever truly mattered. To really understand what happened next, you have to talk to the guys who swung the hammer. I spent a few afternoons with a contractor, let's call him Frank, born and raised in Henderson. His dad was a plasterer, he was a framer, building Vegas was in his blood, and for a while, business was insane. After the great crash of '08, when the bottom fell out and this whole town was a graveyard of foreclosures, Frank thought he was ruined. But then the phone started ringing again, and it didn't stop. The calls weren't from families looking to build their dream home. They were from property management companies with names that sounded more like tech startups than landlords. A guy in a polo shirt with a company logo would meet him at a foreclosed house. Dead lawn, green pool, eviction notice still taped to the door, and hand him a list. "We just bought this one," he'd say, "and the 30 others in this subdivision. We need them all rent ready in 90 days. 30 houses. In one neighborhood." Frank had never heard of anything like it. At first, it was a godsend. It was work. Steady, reliable, no-nonsense work. His crews were busy. He was paying his bills. He told me it felt like they were helping rebuild the city, taking these sad, abandoned houses and breathing life back into them. But after the 100th house, he started to notice something. The instructions were always the same. Rip out the carpet, put in the cheap gray vinyl plank flooring. It looked modern, sure, but it was paper thin. Paint every wall the same neutral grade color. Not white, not beige, but some soulless mix of the two. Install the same brushed nickel fixtures. The same low-end stainless steel appliances that came on a pallet of 50. There was no room for character. No choice. It wasn't about making a home. It was about creating a standardized product. He was no longer a craftsman. He was a technician on an assembly line. His job was to turn unique, individual homes, each with its own story, into uniform, interchangeable rental units. He said the weirdest part was the silence. Usually when you're renovating a house for a family, they're there. The kids are excited, picking out colors for their rooms. The parents are debating granite versus quartz. There's a sense of hope, of a future being built. Here, there was nothing. Just an asset manager on an iPad, checking boxes on a spreadsheet. One day, he told me, he was finishing up a house in a neighborhood he'd played in as a kid, and he realized that his company had flipped nearly every house on that block for the same corporate client. A single entity from New York or San Francisco now owned his entire childhood streets. The families were gone. The homeowners were gone. They'd been replaced by tenants, by a constant churn of people with no deep connection to the place. And these tenants were paying rents that were 30, sometimes 40% higher than the mortgage on that same house would have been just a few years earlier. And that's when you realize this wasn't a recovery. This was a hostile takeover of the American neighborhood. What Frank was witnessing, what the cocktail waitress from part 1 was feeling, wasn't just a market fluctuation. It was a fundamental restructuring of what a house is. You see, after 2008, a handful of Wall Street hedge funds and private equity firms, the same kind of people who'd profited from the crash, looked at the wreckage and saw the biggest fire sale in American history. They didn't see neighborhoods. They saw an undervalued asset class. For a century, the single-family home was the bedrock of the American middle class. It was a place to live, yes, but it was also a nest egg, a tangible piece of your future. These firms realized that if they could buy up enough of these homes, they could change the game entirely. They could turn the American dream into a subscription service. With trillions of dollars in capital, they went on a buying spree. They created complex algorithms to find and purchase homes faster than any family with a real estate agent ever could. They outbid young couples with all cash offers, sight unseen. They weren't just buying a house here and there. They were buying the market itself. They were buying the very idea of home ownership so they could rent it back to the people they'd outbid at a premium. They traded soul for spreadsheets. They took a place of community and turned it into a commodity, no different from oil or gold. Every decision was dictated by a single question. How do we maximize returns for our investors? Need to raise the rent by 10%. The algorithm says yes. Need to add a monthly administrative fee or a pest control surcharge? The data supports it. The fact that the tenant is a single dad working 2 jobs to make ends meet, that's not a variable in the equation. He's just a data point under the heading occupancy rate. So that deal the cocktail waitress remembered, the one where you work hard and the city gives you a shot at a stable life, it was rendered obsolete. It was replaced by a new deal, a colder deal, a deal you sign on a 12-month lease with a faceless corporation 1,000 miles away. The new deal says you will work just as hard, but you will own nothing. You will pay more and more every year for the privilege of living in a house that could be sold out from under you at any moment. Your home is no longer your castle. It is a line item on a quarterly earnings report. The house always wins. Sure, we all knew that. But what nobody saw coming was the house becoming a hedge fund that owns the whole damn street. So where does that leave us now, today? If you want to see the real-time result of trading neighborhoods for stock portfolios, you don't have to look far. You just have to drive a mile or two off the strip, past the pawn shops and the wedding chapels, and look for the signs that read weekly rates available. You'll find the new Las Vegas starter home. It's a 200 square foot room in a place like Budget Suites or Siegel Suites. I spent some time talking to a young couple living in one. He's a bartender at a high-end restaurant in one of the mega casinos. She's a housekeeper at another. Between them, they pull in what, on paper, looks like pretty decent money. They are the engine of this town, the 21st century version of the cocktail waitress from the Stardust. They work hard. They show up on time. They are good at their jobs, and they live with their 5-year-old daughter in a single room. Their kitchen is a microwave and 2 hot plates. Their dining table is the same small desk where their daughter does her coloring. Their living room, bedroom, and playroom are all the same space. They've done their best to make it feel like a home. There are family pictures taped to the wall and a small pile of stuffed animals in the corner. But the illusion shatters every time you look out the window at the parking lot or hear the thin walls vibrate with the arguments of the people next door. This isn't a home, it's a waiting room. But the thing is, they don't know what they're waiting for anymore. They told me their story, and it's a story I've heard over and over again in this city. They had a small apartment, but the rent went up $300 in 1 year. They couldn't keep up, so they moved here to the weekly rental, telling themselves it was temporary, just a way to save up for a deposit on another place. That was 2 years ago. Every week, they pay nearly $400 in cash for this room. That's $1,600 a month for a space smaller than a 2-car garage, with no lease, no rights, no security. They can be kicked out with a week's notice for any reason. Do the math. That's almost $20,000 a year in rent, and they have nothing to show for it. No equity, no stability, not even a good credit score, because these places don't report to credit bureaus. They are caught in a perfect trap. The rent is too high to let them save for a down payment, and the lack of a permanent address makes it impossible to get ahead. He told me, I spend my nights pouring $100 cocktails for people who don't even look at the price, and then I come home here. We are building someone else's dream every single day, and we can't even afford a corner of our own. The bitter irony is that they are surrounded by houses. The very subdivisions that the contractor Frank helped renovate are just a few miles away, but those homes might as well be on the moon. The 3-bedroom house that the cocktail waitress bought with a jar of tips in the 90s? Today, that same unremarkable stucco box rents for $2,400 a month and requires a credit score of 700 and an income of 3 times the rent. It's an impossible number for them. So they stay here, living in the shadow of the very casinos that employ them. Close enough to see the glitter, but too far to feel any of the warmth. And this is where the story of Las Vegas stops being just about Las Vegas. What's happening here? It's a postcard from the future for the rest of America. This isn't just a housing crisis. It's the death of the social contract. It's the final brutal act of a system where labor is devalued and capital is king. We've created an economy where a person can work 40, 50 hours a week at a necessary, vital job and still be unable to afford a safe, stable place to live in the city they serve. This isn't progress. It's a different, more sophisticated kind of hustle. It's the long con. The promise was that if you played by the rules, you'd get a fair shake, but the game has been fundamentally rigged. The house, and by house I don't mean the casino, I mean the entire financialized system, has tilted the table so steeply that the chips all slide to one side. What do we call a society where the people who pour the drinks, clean the rooms, and cook the food can no longer afford to live? It's not a community, it's a stage set, a theme park where the employees have to commute from the margins or live in the storage closets. The couple in the motel, the waitress who lost her neighborhood, the contractor building solar soulless rental units, they are all casualties of this new game. A game where your home is no longer a right, but a luxury item traded by distant, invisible players. They came to Vegas looking for a chance, an opportunity, a piece of the dream, and all they found was that the biggest gamble in town wasn't happening at the poker tables. It was the one they were forced to make every single month just to keep a roof over their heads. It's a gamble that, for a growing number of Americans, no one ever seems to win. In the end, this was never just a story about real estate prices. It was about the slow, deliberate dismantling of a promise. The promise that if you showed up and did the work, you could build a decent life for yourself. We've traced how that promise was bought out, packaged up, and sold for parts by forces that see our towns not as communities, but as entries on a balance sheet. They didn't just raise the rent, they changed the very definition of what a home is meant to be, from a place of sanctuary to a tool for wealth extraction. The old Vegas deal is dead. What has replaced it is a colder, harder reality that's spreading across the country. We've turned the foundation of a stable life into the new high-stakes table, a game where the house isn't just a casino, it's a global investment fund, a game where the price of admission is a life of instability for the many in exchange for guaranteed returns for the few. So the question we're left with is, what is the soul of a city? And what happens when we discover we've sold it? If this story meant something to you, let me know your thoughts in the comments. What's your Vegas story? Subscribing lets us keep digging into the stories that matter. Thanks for listening.